terrorism. Its presence is felt in virtually every corner of the world. While the word itself has become commonplace in our language, few can agree on its definition. But there is one thing we can agree on. Terrorism is a clear and present danger. Broken down to its simplest terms, terrorism is defined as the use or the threatened use of force on innocent people to bring about political change. When looking at terrorist organizations, perception is everything. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. While history is usually written by the victors in any given conflict or era, modern terrorism's focus on the innocent has led to its universal condemnation. The nature of terrorism keeps evolving. As technology and the political landscape of regions change, so do the tactics and the psychological makeup of the terrorists themselves. Over the last half-century, two schools of thought have emerged about what motivates terrorists. One theory states that terrorists are the disenfranchised of the world. Their primary objective is to have injustices addressed and to demand a seat at the table, to be heard. But as body counts continue to rise from terrorist actions, with mass carnage as part of the mission plan, a second school of thought has emerged. James Woosley, the former head of the CIA, argues, terrorists don't want to sit at the table, they want to destroy the table, and everyone sitting at it. This view contends that at least some terrorists are not interested in being included within the political process, but would rather eliminate the process altogether. To better understand the different aspects of terrorism, it is important to look at its roots. The seeds of modern terrorism were sown as early as the Russian Revolution. In October of 1917, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky had a different purpose in mind for the use of terror. They employed it to topple the bourgeoisie government of Russia, but they also wielded it as a means of controlling their internal enemies. Terrorism used for disciplinary means was a new dynamic, one that would become extremely important to other groups in the future. The Russian Revolution was also noteworthy because of its accessibility. Due to the invention of the motion picture camera, others could see the action even though they were thousands of miles away. It became an event that could be experienced, to a certain extent, over and over again. In Ireland, the Easter Rebellion of 1916 broke out. The British Parliament had defeated a push for Irish independence after centuries of colonial rule. The rebellion resulted in dozens of Republicans being executed or sentenced to prison. Michael Collins, a charismatic leader in the Irish Republican Army, studied the tactics utilized in the Russian and American revolutions. 3 years later, Collins and his followers waged an organized campaign, attacking police stations and other symbols of British oppression. Collins became a hero to the Irish, and after 2 years of mayhem, the two sides signed a peace treaty, which eventually led to the forming of the Republic of Ireland in the south, while the north remained under British dominance. Other nationalist movements took note of the Irish victory and their means of achieving it. Radio, television, film, print, and the internet have all contributed to the dissemination of information, allowing terrorist groups to learn and adapt the structures and principles originated by others before them. The shift from a rural to an urban environment was a major factor in the shaping of modern terrorism. Terrorists discovered that they could easily hide in the urban jungle, which gave them a closer proximity to the reins of power and infrastructure. The catalyst for the shift to urban terrorism was the publication of Mini Manual of the Urban Guerrilla. Written by Carlos Marighella, a Brazilian politician and leader of the Nationalist Communist Party, The book became a Bible for various terrorist groups around the world. A highly influential and practical guide, the mini-manual lays out the concept of small urban guerrilla units and the basic structure needed to make them effective. Maragall proposed that it was more effective to have small firing groups, or cells, comprised of 4 or 5 members. Several cells are needed to form an organization. The cells can join together as needed to concentrate their power or act independently as a semi-autonomous unit. Their small size aids both mobility and secrecy. Terrorists situated in targeted nations have a defined mission and have gone through extensive training. A multi-tiered organizational structure limits the potential of betrayal, so that only the top-level command knows information encompassing the entire scope of the mission. As was the case in the attacks on the United States on September 11th, 2001. Cells can remain underground for years, blending into societies, which makes them extremely difficult to detect. A disadvantage of the cell structure is that it can prevent organizations from growing rapidly or working as a cohesive unit with other cells within the organization. The Tupamaros of Uruguay were a radical anti-imperialist group that adapted Maragall's theories. With unprecedented effectiveness, the Tupamaros waged their campaign throughout the capital city, Montevideo, controlling its streets and striking at will. But the group's success was also its undoing. In 1970, they kidnapped American police advisor Dan Mitrione. A few days later, his body was found on the streets of Montevideo with his hands bound and 2 bullets in the back of his head. A note read that he had been tried in the People's Court, found guilty, and executed. This and many other acts began to turn the working class against the group, which was comprised primarily of students. The Tupamaros placed candidates in the election of 1971, but they overestimated their strength, and the election ushered in a right-wing government that responded with a brutal anti-terrorism campaign. By 1972, the group was finished, but the Tupamaros left a lasting mark, and many left and right-wing groups from North America, Europe, and the Middle East adopted their tactics. Another catalyst for the shaping of modern terrorism came from a young Argentinian idealist named Ernesto Che Guevara. Graduating from the University of Buenos Aires with a medical degree, Guevara concentrated on helping the impoverished multitudes of South America. His work eventually brought him into contact with rebel leader Fidel Castro, and the two of them worked together to oust the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. In 1959, they succeeded. Guevara chronicled his experience in Guerrilla Warfare, the memoir of the movement's tactics and struggles. The book gave revolutionaries in other parts of the world both mental and practical ammunition, as it showed them a successful 3-phase approach for overthrowing governments. In Phase 1, action is implemented by isolated pockets of resistance. In Phase 2, the isolated groups merge into guerrilla columns. And finally, in Phase 3, the columns merge together to confront a conventional army. Terrorism evolved over the last century to the extent that today it is found on every continent except Antarctica. How did civilization get to this place? And what are the motivating factors behind terrorism?
In taking a look at some of the motivating factors of terrorism, poverty, ideology, and religion, over and over and over again in international terrorism, these factors become seeds that cause terrorism to germinate.
Experts believe that terrorists forge loyalty to their group members through justification, by arguing and getting agreement that terrorism is a justifiable revenge for social evils.
All warriors need to feel justification. Terrorists are no different. For a terrorist to take violent murderous action, the terrorists must feel that that action is justified, that it's valid.
Terrorism has flourished in advanced nations when the ideological beliefs of a few clash with the political status quo. Left-wing terrorists such as the Baader-Meinhof gang of Germany combined group sex with revolutionary ideology and robbed banks with stolen BMWs to finance their cause. The Red Brigades of Italy believed that a climate of violence would bring revolution to Italy and eventually the rest of Europe. They killed and kidnapped foreigners and assassinated Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro before their group faded away, like many other European and North American left-wing radical organizations of the 60s and 70s. Another factor in the growth of modern terrorism is force multipliers. Experts define this phenomenon as the magnification of the terrorist's power without adding personnel. A handful of terrorists armed with rocks have a limited amount of power. Put Kalashnikovs in the hands of the same number of terrorists and the gun becomes a force multiplier. Media coverage is a powerful force multiplier. As news organizations scramble to cover a terrorist incident or operation, they inadvertently heighten or multiply the impact of the event. Organized terrorist groups seek out force multipliers because they help create the perception that a group is larger and more powerful than it actually is. This in turn can draw more sympathizers and recruits to their cause. Other force multipliers besides media saturation are the use of technology or technological targets to give the illusion of a high level of activity. Transnational support, or support outside the group's home, gives the illusion of the group being able to operate across borders. And finally, religious fanaticism.
Religion becomes a force multiplier because it takes an act that would be abhorrent, that would be hateful, that's disgusting in the human experience, and transforms it into something that is sacramental.
The scale of terrorism has evolved over the past century. The majority of attacks in the early stages of modern terrorism were primarily executed against property, or where they would inflict a small, contained amount of human casualties. But over the past 30 years, the scope of many terrorist attacks has grown. A startling example of this happened on December 21, 1988. Pan Am Flight 103 from London to New York explodes at 31,000 feet over the town of Lockerbie, Scotland. All 259 on board and 11 people on the ground were killed. After a multinational investigation, 2 Libyans, Abdel Basset el-Magrahi and Alamin Khalifa Fima, were charged with conspiracy and murder. Both were working in the travel industry on the Mediterranean island of Malta, with alleged ties to the Libyan intelligence service. It took 11 years to bring them to trial in the Netherlands, under the provision of Scottish law. Fima was acquitted, but Magrahi was pronounced guilty by unanimous verdict. The profile or psychological makeup of terrorists has been dramatically altered over the years. No longer strictly viewed as the dispossessed on the fringes of society, there are numerous types of individuals becoming active in many terrorist organizations. Today's operatives can be highly educated professionals with families. Many have been educated in the West, most notably in Europe and North America. Some terrorists live in the country they'll be called upon to attack. They have spent years honing their ability to blend easily into the local environment, a factor in their recruitment. They understand cultural nuances and local behavior. They live in host countries as normal residents, have families, hold jobs, and can remain members of sleeper cells for years. In an effort to maintain an open society, some Western countries have porous border security. Tracking systems to monitor a foreign guest's stay after they have entered a country legally have been ineffective. This, along with strong laws protecting individual rights, has allowed terrorists to function with relative ease. The cultural meld of the terrorist with the surroundings makes it difficult to avert potential future attacks and investigate missions that have already been executed. Another profile of recruits are individuals already living abroad with no record of previous involvement in a terrorist organization. This was the case with the plotters of a foiled attempt to bomb the US Embassy in Paris, France. Most of the participants came from second-generation middle-class immigrant homes that embraced modern ways. Many grew up in Europe and did not even speak their native tongue. In late November of 2001, the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan captured Taliban fighters in their push to take control of the capital, Kabul. American John Walker Lind was among those captured. Walker fits yet another terrorist profile. Known as white Moors, these individuals fall outside of the target group that terrorist organizations normally recruit from. Experts attribute this attraction to a yearning to belong to a tight-knit group with shared ideals. This was also the case with some of the plotters in the foiled Paris Embassy bombing. Many involved were recent converts who were easily manipulated by the group's leaders. Some of the deadliest terrorist cells are not found in the urban slums of metropolitan areas. A new generation of terrorists operate from the government-subsidized projects and working-class immigrant neighborhoods surrounding major cities. Their reach has been traced to countries such as England, France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany, among others. Extreme nationalism and religious fanaticism are catalysts for breeding terrorism. But high levels of poverty also benefit terrorists in their recruiting. Impoverished nations such as Algeria, Egypt, Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, and Pakistan are fertile areas for terrorist organizations to attract new recruits. Third world birth rates are up to 4 times higher than those of wealthy industrialized nations. This, combined with a rising disparity in income, is a formula for brewing terrorism. Adolescents and even children are frequent targets for recruiting. Once taken in by a group, impoverished young men and boys are easily manipulated. Their views and ideas are largely forged by the group, since they have little exposure outside of their adoptive family. The goal is to take the uneducated and the impoverished and turn them into hardened warriors, ingrained with a narrowly defined worldview and an often deadly mission in life. Gun-for-hire mercenaries are also part of terrorist recruiting scenarios. Carlos the Jackal and Abu Nidal fall into this category. Before he was imprisoned, Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, also known as Carlos the Jackal, was a master of disguise and a cold-blooded killer. The Jackal reportedly worked for numerous sponsors, such as Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Cuban Premier Fidel Castro, President Assad of Syria, and the Italian Red Brigade, among others. Mercenary terrorists can have strong ideological ties to their employer or none at all, with monetary compensation being the sole motivating factor of their missions. Many terrorist organizations have structures similar to legitimate corporations, with top, middle, and lower-level positions. The smallest group is the command, which dictates policy and provides direction. The active cadre or striking arm is the field operatives of the group. The most important level of the organization is the active supporters. Without them, a campaign cannot be sustained. They maintain communication channels, provide safe houses, and meet the logistical needs of the active cadre. There are many more people in support roles than those who actually carry out terrorist acts. Finally, there is a base of passive supporters, those sympathetic to a cause who have not joined the group. The organization relies on them for public opinion. This, in turn, can muster financial and political support, as was the case of the Tupamaros of Uruguay. When the group alienated the mainstream, the passive supporters deserted their cause. Recent intelligence reports indicate that many groups are moving away from this structure to a more independent, self-managing model. Funding of terrorist organizations and their operations comes from a variety of different sources. Backing from supporters sympathetic to a cause can be in the form of monetary funding, information, shelter, cover, or other forms of cooperation which enable the group to flourish. Terrorist organizations have learned much from organized crime syndicates such as the Mafia. They launder money through legitimate companies, invest in the stock market, and even own businesses such as Al-Qaeda's Tanzanite mining operation in Tanzania, Africa. Many transactions are done in cash, and like the Mafia, they employ coercion and blackmail. While they cannot possibly force someone to become an active terrorist, they do raise money, similar to the Mafia's protection money, receive other resources, information and cooperation by means of invoking fear and threats.
Terrorists use foundations and charities. Many times unsuspecting people will donate to these charities and the money rolls into the terrorist group. Other times, charities are set up and people know they're donating to the terrorist group, know they'll be hunted down, or at least they'll be penalized if they make a donation to the group, so they use the charity as a front.
Terrorist organizations and host countries have used the illegal narcotics trade to finance their campaigns. Afghanistan, under the rule of the Taliban, officially banned opium production, yet funneled money from it to help finance Al-Qaeda, the terrorist network founded by Osama bin Laden. Money raised from marketing contraband drugs can be used for a variety of reasons, such as the building and support of training facilities and the purchase and stockpiling of weapons. According to Joseph Bodansky, author of Bin Laden, the man who declared war on America, Al-Qaeda paid $30 million in cash and 2 tons of Afghan heroin, worth an estimated street value of $700 million, for nuclear weapons on the Chechen black market. Intelligence networks are not in total agreement on this information, but its prospect is frightening. The Middle East is peppered with terrorist hotspots where violence flares and subsides in a seemingly never-ending cycle. The conflicts involved date back decades, centuries, even millennia. To understand the political and cultural dynamics that influence this area of the world, terrorism expert Jonathan R. White categorizes the problems into 3 distinct but interrelated issues. Rivalries between Arab countries. Rivalries between the Shiite and Sunni Muslims, 2 major sects of the Islamic religion, and the control of the area known as Palestine and the nation of Israel. 2 major events of modern times impacted these 3 issues: the division of Dar al-Islam in 1916 and the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. In the early part of the last century, Great Britain and France controlled most of the Middle East through their colonial empires. In the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, they divided the region known as Dar al-Islam, the ancient Arab realm, into what they termed as spheres of influence to further ensure their colonial interests in the area. This partitioning created countries and borders that did not reflect realistic divisions in the area. Tribal and family influence, which meant more to the populace, were not primary considerations. These artificial boundaries created in the agreement have been a continuous source of rivalry between Arab nations ever since. State-sponsored terrorist groups and rogue terrorists constantly struggle for control in these areas. At times, there is a direct attempt to redefine the boundaries themselves, which can evolve into open warfare, as was the case in Lebanon and Kuwait. Terrorism is also a major ingredient in the rivalry between the Sunni and Shiite Muslims. While the Sunnis are Islam's largest sect, comprising approximately 90% of all Muslims, in Iran, Shiites are the majority. In 1953, fearful of the spread of communism, the United States Central Intelligence Agency engineered the return of the Shah of Iran to his country. The Shah had been displaced by leftist forces. The Americans viewed the Shah as a friend and an ally, but the majority of Shiites saw this as yet another imperialistic nation meddling in their affairs. Attracted to Western society, the Shah wanted to modernize the country. This further alienated Shiite holy leaders. Fearing his own people, the Shah created a secret military police force known as Savak that murdered and tortured many of his political opponents. Ruling with an iron fist, pressure continued to build for over 2 decades. In February of 1979, rallying behind the exiled religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, the Iranian Revolution swept through the streets of Tehran and the surrounding countryside. Khomeini issued a religious decree, or fatwa. This holy war, or jihad, was against the West and the traitors of Islam. The idea that a jihad could be declared against anything Western and anyone or anything non-Islamic would become a new impetus for terrorism in the world. After the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Shiite fundamentalists from Iran poured into the Lebanese countryside. Iran established 2 organizations that would continue to wreak havoc in the name of God: Hezbollah, or the Party of God, and Islamic Jihad. Hezbollah is committed to the disruption of any peace with Israel and spreading the Shiite Iranian revolution to other countries. Islamic Jihad, sharing similar goals, carried out a suicide bombing campaign in Lebanon in the early 1980s. Shortly thereafter, their operation spread to Kuwait, Tunisia, and Europe. They have declared a holy war against anyone resisting the Islamic Revolution. Khomeini believed that the revolution was the first step in purifying the world. The call of Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution was not lost on other organizations. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad predates the Iranian Revolution, but it gathered support, at least partially inspired by Khomeini's rise to power. In 1981, they assassinated Egyptian President Anwar Sadat for orchestrating peace with Israel. In 1997, another terrorist organization based out of Egypt, the Islamic Group, murdered 58 tourists from Europe, Japan, and Colombia near the town of Luxor, virtually shutting down the lucrative Egyptian tourism industry. The second major event which impacted the Middle East was the formation of the nation-state of Israel. During World War I, while the British controlled Palestine, they promised Arab Palestinians autonomy in exchange for fighting the Turks, who were allied with the Germans. In the Balfour Agreement of 1916, the British also promised Palestinian Jews a Jewish homeland for their help against the Turks.
If the British intended to give Dar al-Islam to the Arabs, they couldn't give the homeland of Israel to the Jews. And if they promised to give the homeland of Israel to the Jews, they could not give Dar al-Islam to the Arabs. So the promises are contradictory.
After the war, when neither of these promises were kept, neither was the peace. Sporadic violence from Jews and Arabs against the British broke out. At the close of World War II, thousands of Jews displaced by the Holocaust fled Europe for their promised homeland, Palestine. Alarmed and overwhelmed by the massive influx of Jews, Arabs began to arm themselves, and the British limited the entrance of Jewish refugees. The Jewish terrorist organization Irgun Tzva'i Leumi launched a series of attacks against the British and Arab Palestinians. The destruction of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, led by the future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, helped force the British to seek a solution. Asking the United Nations to intervene, on May 15, 1948, Palestine was partitioned between the Arabs and the Jews, forming the new Jewish nation-state of Israel. Arab Palestinians and many other Arab groups were incensed by what they perceived as a European-created state in their homeland. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed by Yasser Arafat in 1957 as an outlet for that anger. Gathering displaced Palestinians in Jordan, Arafat created the PLO as a multinational alliance against Israel. In 1967, outnumbered Israeli forces defeated their Arab neighbors in what became known as the Six-Day War. Frustrated, the PLO struck back with hit-and-run tactics. Rather than confronting soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces, they turned their focus towards civilians, attacking school children, apartment complexes, buses, and other civilian targets. The Israelis seemed incapable of combating these subversive tactics. The PLO's profile rose to another level on March 21, 1968. Tired of Arafat's raids from across the Jordanian border, Israel launched a ferocious attack with heavy armor and helicopter gunships. With the help of the Jordanian army, the Palestinians held their ground, and Yasser Arafat became a hero to many Arabs. Media attention brought by the Battle of Karama and highly visible PLO terrorist attacks inspired other terrorist organizations from Spain, Ireland, and Germany. They turned to the PLO for tactics and training. Over the next 10 years, the PLO continued to grow, primarily operating out of Lebanon. It attacked Israeli targets while splinter groups broke off doing the same. In 1982, Arafat fled his compound in Lebanon as the Israeli army struck with a three-pronged invasion. Exiled in Libya, he gradually shifted away from terrorism in order to be recognized by legitimate governments. In 1988, Yasser Arafat made an historic announcement.
Hereby once more declare that I condemn terrorism in all its forms.
But by this time, PLO radical splinter groups such as Hamas, Abu Nidal, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine had broken off, or would do so shortly thereafter, to spread their own brand of terrorism. The Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, named after Jerusalem's landmark mosque, has ties to the PLO, has run one of the bloodiest campaigns to date. Outnumbering attacks by Hamas 5-1, their use of female suicide bombers is particularly troublesome, as are the targeting of women and children. Middle East expert Ilan Peleg notes that these splinter groups, among others, embraced the concept of rejectionism, the refusal of any peaceful settlement with Israel, and the ruling out of any treaty that acknowledges Israel's right to exist. Islamic extremists do not have a monopoly on terrorism in the Middle East.
I want to throw all the Arabs out of Israel. Out, out, out.
Jewish fundamentalist groups such as Kach, founded by American Rabbi Meir Kahane, are committed to blocking any peace proposals with Palestinians or recognizing their territorial rights. The 1994 slaughter of nearly 24 Muslims as they worshipped in a mosque by Kach member Baruch Goldstein is an example of how far some Jewish groups are willing to go. Eyal, the Israeli Avenging Organization, a militant extremist group, has been linked to the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Eyal, Kach, and other Jewish extremist organizations have been declared terrorists and condemned by Israel. New York City, September 11, 2001. Two hijacked Boeing 767s crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center as the world looked on. The terrorist attack was unprecedented in its carnage. In the media coverage which followed, the attack exposed how a high-tech urban society could be seriously impacted by a low-tech, well-planned, inexpensive terrorist campaign. Western nations rallied behind the United States, forming a coalition to fight terrorism. Their primary target, Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda network. Al-Qaeda, or the Base, is an international terrorist organization whose primary goal is to support the pan-Islamic movement, bringing Sunni and Shiite Muslims together. Their goal is to purge Islamic land of infidels and their influence, including many Muslims who currently head those Islamic nations. During the Soviet-Afghan War, Osama bin Laden joined the Afghan resistance called the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors. He quickly earned a reputation as a battlefield hero. At the time, the democratic nations of the West characterized bin Laden as a freedom fighter, struggling against the spread of communism. Mujahideen leaders courted financial support in the US, calling the Soviets infidels and foreign devils. Using money, weapons, and logistical support funneled through the US Central Intelligence Agency, the war finally turned, and the Mujahideen drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein wanted Kuwait's oil-rich land and accessible ports. He annexed the country as Iraqi soil, claiming that Iraq had been unfairly divided from its land by the imperialist West. At the request of the Saudi royal family, the United States and its allies established bases in Saudi Arabia to fight the Iraqis in Operation Desert Storm. The American-led coalition quickly drove back the Iraqis, but this angered bin Laden and other radical Muslims. Near Islam's holiest shrines in Mecca and Medina, the infidels were supervising Muslims fighting other Muslims. When the Americans stayed on after the war at the request of the Saudi government, bin Laden's ire turned toward the United States and Muslim regimes supportive of the West, and what he viewed as corrupt and illegitimate Arab governments. According to White, bin Laden believed the Soviet Union had not collapsed under the weight of political, economic, and military factors. It fell by the hand of God. The Soviets' retreat was a sign of God's power over Satan. And if God could bring down the Soviet Union through the work of the Mujahideen, other evil nations were doomed to destruction. The nation at the top of bin Laden's list was the United States. Bin Laden formed the terrorist network Al-Qaeda with the help of money inherited through his family's construction conglomerate. The organization carried out the most far-reaching campaign of terror to date. Because of Al-Qaeda's wealth, they have been able to set up an international network of unprecedented support, with operations based not only out of the Middle East, but also in Europe, Africa, North America, and the Philippines. Al-Qaeda operations have taken the magnitude of terrorist violence to a new level. They trained and supported the attack on American troops on a humanitarian mission in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1993. The harrowing two-day battle downed 2 U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopters, and 18 members of U.S. Special Forces were killed. The organization has also been linked to the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, the 1995 truck bombing in Riyadh, which killed 7, and a 1996 truck bombing in Dhahran, killing 19, both in Saudi Arabia. The back-to-back bombings in 1998 of the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, killed 225 and wounded over 4,500 people. A home video shot by a follower provided a smoking gun of evidence that Al-Qaeda leaders, including bin Laden, planned the suicide missions of 9/11, killing over 3,000 people in Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and New York City, and injuring thousands of others. Military Studies in the Jihad Against the Tyrants, a 180-page handbook seized at the Manchester, England home of a bin Laden disciple, has become a guiding manual for Al-Qaeda and other radical Islamic groups. In it are outlines of a variety of terrorist acts, including assassinations, forging documents, poisonings, and bombings. It sets out strict and chilling requirements for terrorist operatives. It teaches them how to live among the enemy, conduct their daily affairs, communication techniques, and security measures for each level of membership, whether they are in the command, active cadre, or active support. The handbook also includes instructions on how to overcome interrogations and endure torture. The mainstay of terrorist tactics has been bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings. But terrorism is constantly changing and evolving. What, if anything, will take their place? The answer may be in the workings of the fanatical religious cult Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth. In March 1995, the cult, in an effort to disrupt the Japanese government, carried innocent-looking packages onto a subway in Tokyo. Each terrorist punctured his lethal package just before 8 a.m. Sarin, a deadly, odorless, colorless gas developed by the Nazis, worked its way through the subway system, eventually killing 12 people and sending almost 6,000 victims to the hospital. The group's ultimate goal was to purify the world and spread what its followers believed was the messianic truth of its leader, Shoko Asahara. But it was the delivery system which had experts concerned. Technological terrorism is defined as the use of a weapon of mass destruction or an attack on technological systems designed to create massive chaos in an act of terrorism. As early as 1980, experts such as Brian Clark have sounded warnings that terrorism will emerge as the foremost concern in the world when they begin to take advantage of technology. This prediction proved to be chillingly accurate. Technological attacks can be broken down into 5 major categories: biological, chemical, nuclear, infrastructural, and cyber terrorism. The basis of all biological weapons are poisons and microorganisms produced by animals and plants. These agents produce infectious diseases that are incapacitating or even fatal. There are 3 major categories of biological weapons: viruses such as anthrax, smallpox, and botulism, natural poisons including venom, saxitoxin, and ricin, and finally plagues such as bubonic. But experts are concerned that genetic engineering could produce an entirely new category of biological weapon as research in this area continues to evolve.
The world's very vulnerable to these activities because there's rapid intercontinental travel. And some of these diseases might have an incubation period, a period between infection and disease of up to 1 or 2 weeks. So if people were infected somewhere, they could travel very widely.
Chemical weapons are divided into 4 basic categories. Blistering agents such as mustard gas burn the skin. Nerve agents like sarin cause the uncontrolled expulsion of body fluids and muscle spasms and can kill within minutes. Choking agents such as chlorine gas fill the lungs with secretions and drown their victims. Blood agents such as hydrogen cyanide used in Nazi death camps are absorbed by breathing. There are factors that make both biological and chemical weapons attractive to terrorists. They are easy to transport and they can be deployed with simple delivery systems. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, a series of anthrax-laced envelopes were mailed to various individuals in the US government and media. The terrorists involved were able to transport their deadly envelopes through the mail. These attacks were relatively inexpensive to produce and acted as a force multiplier. There are also factors which make biological and chemical weapons unattractive to terrorists. Biological weapons, and to a lesser extent chemical weapons, are difficult to control. They can easily contaminate unintended victims, as experts have asserted in the case of anthrax-laced letters. The terrorists themselves could also end up as unintended victims. And most biological agents are destroyed by weather or sunlight. Chemical weapons in general are not as lethal as biological ones. While they are easier to control, they tend to dissipate into the atmosphere. Rogue nations who support and harbor terrorists, such as Iraq, have been developing chemical and biological weapons in violation of agreements signed after the Gulf War of 1991. Hussein has used deadly mustard gas against the Kurdish minority citizens in northern Iraq. The threat of nuclear terrorism has been an issue since the 1970s. As the proliferation of nuclear materials increases with the development of nuclear weapons and power plants, the likelihood that this material will end up in the wrong hands increases.
The urgency is that the theft of nuclear material is certainly a significant event if that would occur. And it's very important that the specialists who operate the technologies that we see here today be trained so that there isn't any possible way that material can be stolen.
Only a few years ago, the idea of terrorists possessing nuclear weapons seemed unthinkable. Today, this threat is taken much more seriously. While detonating a nuclear weapon is technically complex and difficult to achieve, there are other concerns about nuclear terrorism. The spread of radioactive material through the use of a conventional bomb, dirty bombs as they're referred to, could be used to spread nuclear waste stolen from a poorly guarded energy plant.
Such a bomb might be attractive to terrorists because it would greatly complicate any recovery efforts. It would contaminate a very wide area of a city, several square blocks, for example, with radioactive material. The whole site would have to be excavated and removed.
The threat of terrorists ransoming nuclear materials is another concern. And the takeover of a nuclear facility could result in the entire plant being used as a weapon. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the huge land mass was broken into 15 independent republics. Of those, Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan have been left with nuclear facilities. Transition from the state-supported economy to capitalism has been slow and painful for many of these republics. Russia struggles to establish a modern market economy and achieve strong economic growth. Ex-Soviet nuclear engineers and scientists, once employed by the state, must now search for ways to support themselves. Terrorist groups and rogue nations are willing and able to pay for the expertise. Control over nuclear inventories and their movement is much more difficult now than in the closely guarded borders of the former Soviet regime.
Преступная группировка, у нее ходило 11 человек, значит, похитили около 100 килограмм урана. Цель, как показали предварительные мероприятия наши оперативные, заключалась в том, чтобы продать.
Economic hardship in Russia and developing nations such as Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan have made it a struggle to maintain tight security. Traditional weapons smuggled across borders end up in black markets such as the one in Peshawar, the tribal area of northern Pakistan. Speculation that terrorists could obtain nuclear warheads or suitcase-sized nuclear devices remains a constant concern to the international community. In the fall of 2001, Western nations sounded their concerns to Russian President Vladimir Putin. He assured them that Russia's nuclear stockpiles and facilities were safe and remain intact. But doubts continue to linger as terrorist attacks around the globe escalate, leaving the threat of nuclear terrorism an open question. Infrastructural terrorism, the targeting of key systems which help run a society, is another area of concern. Attacking energy delivery systems such as oil and gas pipelines and power grids could have a crippling effect, as would attacks on transportation centers such as airports and railways. Cyber terrorism is another category of technological terrorism that threatens financial institutions, corporations, law enforcement agencies, and the military, among others.
Ultimately, someone could walk into an internet cafe with a diskette, plug that diskette into the drive, and push the go button, and this virus could be all over the world in a matter of hours.
Safeguards such as encryption, firewalls, and antivirus protection can help keep terrorist hackers from disrupting services, stealing information, and sabotaging these systems. But only when they are managed with unflagging vigilance.
Unfortunately, we are going to be involved in a war in the shadows for a very long time. Criminal justice forces and military forces must prepare for a long war. It may be 10 years, it may be 20, but it's going to be around for a while.
The threat of terrorism may always be with us, but because of its growing presence, there is a renewed sense of purpose and urgency in deterring it. Combating terrorism involves aggressive campaigns against terrorist leaders and their bases, as well as the relentless pressuring of rogue nations that sponsor terrorists. Trade embargoes, economic sanctions, and other measures that impact not only the rogue nations' standing in the international community, but also their effectiveness at governing at home should also be considered. A focused strategy incorporating both military and economic actions where needed and targeting those responsible will reduce the hardships that a society as a whole must endure. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, a coalition of nations was formed to fight terrorism with a multifaceted approach. The coalition's efforts include a wide range of activities. Over 140 countries have issued orders freezing the assets of suspected terrorists and organizations.
Those who do business with terror will do no business with the United States.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization quickly invoked its treaty obligations, directly assisting in the defense of member nations. The Financial Action Task Force, a 29-nation cooperative effort, was formed to promote policies combating money laundering and to adopt strict new standards for denying terrorists access to the world financial system. Coinciding with this, the G20, an international forum of finance ministers, and the International Monetary Fund have agreed to make public the list of terrorists whose assets are subject to freezing. The United Nations has unanimously adopted a wide-ranging and comprehensive resolution to combat international terrorism. Resolution 1373's aim is to raise the average level of government performance against terrorism across the globe, acknowledging that all states must undertake the hard steps needed to defeat terrorism. Through upgrading the capacity of each nation's legislation and executive machinery to fight terrorism, every government will be responsible for ensuring that there is no weak part of the chain. Other actions that many countries have implemented or are reviewing include the rejuvenation of intelligence gathering networks after their demise following the end of the Cold War, plus extending multinational intelligence cooperation and information sharing on terrorist organizations. Constant monitoring of social climates and the forces that produce violence is believed to be a necessary step in curtailing it. Terrorist tracking task forces to prevent operatives from entering a country or locate and remove those who already have. Upgrading airport and airline security standards, implementing both new technology and extensively trained security personnel to help ensure traveler safety. Revitalizing cooperation between government agencies and private industry to help in the area of cybersecurity, ensuring that key infrastructures are protected. Environmental agencies working more closely with water utilities, chemical, pesticide, petroleum, and fertilizer manufacturers to increase their vigilance and secure their resources against an attack. Assisting in the economic redevelopment of impoverished nations with the goal of economic stability as a viable alternative to the lure of terrorism. Looking beyond the Middle East, Africa, with its large, undereducated, malnourished population, is emerging as a major recruiting area for the foot soldiers of terrorism. Subversive organizations are aware that many parts of the continent have poor law and border enforcement, plus weak security and judicial systems. Developed nations need to take the initiative to help turn this breeding ground of terrorism around. More open trade and investment, improved healthcare systems, increased assistance in education, and bridging the digital divide are some steps that also need to be taken. Developed nations have supported governments which are less than ideal by Western standards, but are considered to be more desirable than a theocracy of religious extremists. But experts point out that wherever fundamentalists have been involved with day-to-day politics, in countries such as Turkey, Iran, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, their appeal quickly disappears. These and other actions will help prevent terrorism from spreading and bring rogue nations back into the fold of the international community. Ultimately, being alert is the most potent weapon in detecting and preventing future attacks. Whether it is the vigilance of law enforcement, security personnel, or the public in general, vigilance is the only way to deal with a clear and present danger.